The bullet came from his own side. That was the part nobody ever talked about afterward. Not the alien queen standing exposed on the ridge in her ceremonial war armor. Not the sniper from Delta Company who had a clean shot and a clear order and a finger already squeezing. What nobody talked about was how Sergeant First Class Deo Akafor had been moving before he even thought about moving. His body making a decision his brain was still debating. Stepping into the line of fire because something in him said not yet, and his legs just agreed. The round punched through his left shoulder, went clean through. He dropped to one knee on the ash-gray rock of the Kesarim Ridge, and the alien queen stood 2 feet behind him, alive, her outer shell, the ceremonial carapace they called a Veltion, the thing that marked her as untouchable, cracked cleanly at the shoulder joint from a ricochet fragment. Not dead, not even close to dead, but bleeding. They were both bleeding. She looked at him, he looked back, neither said a word. That was how it started. The war had been running for 11 months, by the time it stopped making sense to Sergeant Akafor, which meant it had been running for 11 months. The Velkash, that was the species designation the UN contact team had assigned, though the soldiers just called them the shells, or the carapace, or sometimes just them, had arrived in the outer belt with 17 warships the size of city blocks and opened the conversation by destroying the Europa station with a weapon that turned the ice moon's surface to steam in under 4 minutes. No warning, no demand, no explanation offered even after the fact. Their first message to humanity came 6 days later, delivered through a frequency that should have been mathematically impossible to broadcast on, translated by an algorithm that wasn't supposed to work and did anyway. The message said, "You are in the corridor." 3 words, that was all. The UN spent 3 weeks trying to find out what it meant, what corridor, what the violation was, whether there was a way out of whatever offense humanity had apparently committed simply by existing where it existed. The Velkash didn't respond to any attempts at communication. They just waited. Then they destroyed the lunar shipyard at Tycho and sent a second message. "You are still in the corridor." So the war started, not because humanity wanted it, not because anyone had a plan, but because when something bigger than you destroys 2 of your installations in a month and won't explain itself, eventually, the generals run out of patience and the politicians run out of alternatives and the orders come down and the ships go up. It was a war prosecuted mostly by people who were afraid, against an enemy they didn't understand, over a cause that nobody could articulate with any precision. Which, when you said it that way, sounded like most wars. But most wars at least had a legible antagonism at the core: territory, ideology, resources, old wounds. This one had 3 words and silence. The 3 words didn't illuminate and the silence didn't relent, and so humans being humans, the generals built strategies around the only legible thing available to them: force. What force produced, over 11 months, was a casualty count on both sides that made the history books later, and a geopolitical situation that grew more complex and more dangerous with every engagement. Humanity pushed and the Velkash pushed back, and neither side broke because neither side understood what breaking was supposed to accomplish, because neither side understood what the other side wanted, because neither side— this was the part that Akafor would come back to later, when he had the context to understand it. Neither side actually wanted what the other side assumed they wanted. Akafor had been on the 3rd wave. Infantry assignment, surface operations, a posting he'd requested specifically because he had spent 15 years getting very good at operating in environments that wanted to kill him, and the vacuum of space, he figured, was just another environment. He'd survived 2 orbital drops over the Kuiper engagement. He'd been in the Phobos tunnels when the shells pushed through the northern egress, and the unit ahead of his had ceased to exist in under 90 seconds. He'd pulled 3 soldiers out of a pressurized wreck on the Martian surface, while Velkash orbital fire was walking its way toward him in 30-meter increments, each impact closer than the last. the ground shaking in a rhythm that felt almost musical, almost patient, like something counting down. He was very good at not dying. What he was less good at, his commanding officers had noted in evaluations stretching back 8 years, was obeying orders that struck him as wrong. Not illegal orders. He'd never refused one of those. He'd never been given one, not really, not the kind that crossed a line so bright it left burn marks on your conscience. The orders he struggled with were the ones that just felt wasteful. Wrong in the way that an ill-fitting gear feels wrong, grinding where it should turn smooth, burning energy that could go somewhere useful. He had a habit, his evaluation said, of improvising in situations where the parameters of improvisation had not been authorized. He thought of it as thinking. His mother had called it the same thing, which was not a coincidence. She had been an engineer for 32 years, the kind of engineer who saw a malfunctioning system and could not rest until she understood why it was failing, not just how to patch it. He'd grown up watching her sit at the kitchen table with schematics spread across it, annotating in a handwriting so small it was almost shorthand, and the thing he'd absorbed from that wasn't the technical knowledge, though some of that had settled into him too. It was the specific posture of her attention, the way she'd look at a problem with an expression that said, "There is something here that wants to be understood, and I am going to understand it." He had that posture. It had served him well in environments that wanted to kill him. It had served him less well with superior officers who wanted compliance rather than comprehension. Kesarim Ridge was a frozen ridge on the fourth moon of a gas giant that didn't have a human name yet, just a catalog number, in a system that humanity had reached 6 weeks ago in a push the generals were calling Engagement 7, and the soldiers were calling Desperate Play. The idea was to press deep into Velkash territorial space, find something worth threatening, and use it as leverage to force the communication that 11 months of warfare hadn't produced. Ground teams would establish positions on the moon's surface. Orbital assets would hold station. Somebody up the chain believed that if they pushed far enough and fast enough, the shells would have to start talking. They had been talking. They'd been talking in weapons instead of words, which everybody had been doing, which was getting all of them exactly nowhere. The moon itself was cold in the specific way of places where cold had been the permanent condition for so long that it had stopped being a weather state and become a material property. The rock itself felt cold, the way wood absorbs heat and stone doesn't. His rebreather processed the thin atmosphere into something breathable but not comfortable, and the gas giant above, enormous, banded in amber and rust and pale green, ringed, the rings visible at an angle that put them across the sky like a brushstroke, cast a reflected light that was better than nothing and stranger than anything natural-born. The shadows it made didn't fall straight. The color it gave everything was slightly off from any color Akafir could name, a gold that was also somehow gray, an orange that was also somehow blue. He had been on Kesarim for 9 days when the queen arrived. He didn't know she was a queen at first. The intelligence briefings on Velkash hierarchy were thin, 11 months of war, and they still didn't understand the social structure, couldn't reliably distinguish unit commanders from frontline soldiers from what appeared to be administrative or ceremonial figures. The shells didn't vary in size or obvious biological markers of status. What they varied in was armor. The more elaborate the carapace, the higher the rank, that much the analysts had worked out. The ceremonial ones, the ones with the additional outer layer, the Velshan, seemed to be the senior-most figures. The one who stepped onto the ridge at 400 hours local, in the gray pre-dawn that came from the gas giant's reflected light rather than any sun, was wearing the most elaborate carapace Akafir had ever seen outside a photograph. It moved like fluid. It seemed to breathe. The secondary shell, the Velshan, was engraved in patterns that caught the gas giant glow and held it, phosphorescent, turning her into something that walked between the categories of weapon and sacred object. She was accompanied by 6 guards, and she was walking straight up the ridge toward the human perimeter. Akafir had the watch. He was the only one who saw her coming. He had 3 seconds to do whatever he was going to do, and in those 3 seconds he made a calculation that would have horrified his commanding officer, and that he could not have explained then or afterward without resorting to the phrase "it just seemed right." The alien queen, and he understood in some wordless way that she was a queen, that the weight she moved with was the weight of authority, of someone accustomed to the world rearranging itself around her passage, was walking toward him without weapons drawn. Her guards had weapons, she did not. He stepped out from behind the rock. Not to fight, not to surrender. He just stepped out and stood there in the open, in the cold, thin atmosphere that his rebreather was processing, and he looked at her. She stopped. Her guards raised weapons. She made a sound, low, vibrational, something that moved through the rock under his boots rather than the air, and they lowered them. She looked at him for a long time. The gas giant turned behind her. In the distance, across the ridge, a Delta Company sniper settled into a firing position that Akafor couldn't see but could feel with the back of his neck the way you feel weather changing. A prickling certainty. The same feeling he'd had in the Phobos tunnels right before the shells pushed through. That pressure drop awareness his body had developed for situations where something was about to happen that couldn't be untaken. He thought, she's trying to communicate something. He thought, she came out here in person in the middle of the night, in the most exposed position imaginable without a weapon in her hands, and she's doing the thing that nobody on either side has managed to do in 11 months. And the sniper in Delta Company has a protocol and a clear line of sight, and an order that predates this moment, and covers this exact scenario. He thought the sniper is going to take the shot. He stepped between her and where the shot would come from. The round hit him at the shoulder joint, found the gap in his armor there, punched through muscle and the outer edge of bone, and kept going. The fragment that split off on exit caught the Veltian at the shoulder and cracked it like glass. He went down to one knee, stayed there. Didn't let himself fall all the way, because falling all the way felt like the end of something that shouldn't end yet. She reached out and put one hand, the Velkash upper forelimb, 6-fingered, 3-jointed, with the inner fingers longer than the outer ones in a proportion that always looked slightly wrong to human eyes, on his wounded shoulder. Not pressing, not grabbing, just resting there, feeling. He looked up at her. The gas giant turned behind her, slow and enormous, filling a third of the sky. She made that sound again, the vibrational one. This one was different in quality, lower, longer. It moved through the rock and up through his kneecap and into his chest, and he had the peculiar sensation that it was trying to become something he could understand, the way you sometimes sense a language underneath another language, the grammar trying to surface through unfamiliar sounds. What happened next took 3 hours, and the full accounting of it only emerged over the weeks that followed, when the translation team finally cracked enough of the Velkash communicative register to assemble a coherent picture. The alien queen, whose name, roughly rendered, was something like Velshara of the third house of Kesarim, which meant that the moon itself, this small frozen rock in a system that humanity had reached by the skin of its teeth, was her home, had been her home, that humanity had landed on her ancestral ground, and she had come in person to see the creatures who had arrived in the corridor, had walked up that ridge in the pre-dawn because she wanted to understand. She had been, the translation team eventually established, the loudest voice in the Velkash high command for the past 8 months arguing against the war. Not because she was soft, not because she was inexperienced. She had led House Kesarim through 2 prior territorial conflicts and won both. She had held the Kesarim system against an incursion from the 7th Fleet of a species whose name, translated roughly as the Unmoored, who had made a habit of claiming contested corridors, and she had won by a combination of strategic patience and tactical brutality that the Velkash historical record still cited as exemplary. She was not a figure of sentiment. She was a figure of intelligence, and intelligence told her that something about this war did not fit the pattern of wars she understood. She had watched 11 months of warfare produce nothing except casualties on both sides, and she had looked at the pattern of human behavior in that time. The way the human forces fought, the way they communicated with each other, the small particular textures of how they moved and rested and died, and she had developed a theory. Her theory was that humans didn't know what the corridor was. The corridor wasn't a place in the Velkash understanding. It wasn't a physical lane of space. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, older than any living generation, that certain paths through certain systems belong to certain lineages, not as property but as identity, the way a language belongs to the people who speak it. Every spacefaring species in this region of the galaxy understood the corridor, had understood it for 800 years. The recognition was transmitted as part of first contact between any new spacefaring species and the oldest established corridors in the region. It was, in Velkash terms, the first thing you told a new people when they arrived. You told them about the corridors. You gave them the map such as it was. You ensured they understood. Humanity had never been told. Not because of malice, because humanity was new. Because the species had only reached the outer belt in the last 40 years and the process by which the corridor was communicated. The message, the acknowledgement, the formal recognition that initiated a new species into the navigational understanding, had never been completed. Humanity had moved into the corridor the way a child walks through someone's house looking for the bathroom, not knowing it was a house, not knowing anyone lived there, not intending any insult by the walking. And the Velkash had responded the way you respond when you find a stranger in your house, who won't stop moving even after you've told them to stop. Except they hadn't told them. They had said you are in the corridor and expected that to be sufficient because to any other species it would have been. The concept was so fundamental, so bedrock, that the idea of it being unknown was almost literally inconceivable. The word for the corridor in the Velkash language was also the word for existence with others. It was the same word. The corridor was not a place you entered. It was the condition of being a species among other species, of having presence in a galaxy that was already occupied, of accepting that your movement through space was a thing that had context. To not know the corridor was to not know that other people existed, which was a category of ignorance that the Velkash language did not have a word for because the Velkash had never imagined it was possible to reach space without understanding the galaxy you were reaching into. Velshara had conceived it, had sat with the inconceivable thing and turned it over and looked at it from the angles her colleagues refused to look from, and had come to believe that the humans fighting so hard, dying so many deaths, pressing so desperately into Velkash space, weren't doing it out of aggression. They were doing it because they didn't understand what they'd done, and they were trying to force a communication that the Velkash weren't offering. They were answering violence with questions, or asking questions with violence. She wasn't sure which, and she suspected they weren't either. She had wanted to see a human up close, wanted to stand near one and feel the quality of their presence, because among the Velkash, the presence of a person told you things that words and data could not, the weight of their intent, the texture of their purpose, whether they were oriented toward damage or toward contact. You could model behavior from intelligence reports indefinitely and never know what you'd know from 1 minute of standing near the being in question. This was not mysticism. It was a form of information gathering that operated below the threshold of language, and Velshara trusted it the way she trusted the navigational charts of the corridor. Imperfectly, probabilistically, but more than she trusted models built from observation at distance. She had walked up the ridge, alone except for necessary guards, without weapons, at the hour when the gas giant hung lowest in the sky, and the light was most complex, because she had wanted to stand near a human and know. The human had stepped out from behind a rock. He'd been afraid, she'd felt it in the air, which among the Velkash was quite literal, pheromonal, a thing the body communicated before the mind could arrange it, but he hadn't moved from fear. He'd stayed still. He'd looked at her. And she had felt in that look something she didn't have a word for in her own language, which surprised her, because the Velkash had an enormous language. They had words for 47 distinct states of attention, and 12 categories of recognition, and 9 varieties of the specific feeling that arose when a long-held assumption turned out to be wrong. They had a word for the silence after music ends that is still holding the shape of what it carried. They did not have a word for what she felt when this human looked at her from 10 meters away in the gas giant light, with fear in his chemistry and stillness in his body, and something in his dark eyes that was reaching. The word, she learned later, was recognition. That was the word humans used. Then the shot came, and the human stepped into it. She stood over him in the gray light with her Velshin cracked at the shoulder, the first time it had ever been damaged, the first time any Velshin in House Kesarim had been damaged since the last territorial war, 3 generations ago, and she felt the shape of the situation change around her the way air pressure changes before a storm. The guards wanted to retreat. She overrode them with a single sound. She put her hand on his wound, feeling the warmth of him, the specific temperature of human blood which ran several degrees warmer than Velkash biological fluid, which was surprising, and then the more surprising fact that the surprise didn't make her pull back, and she made the sound that in her language meant I see you and I will not look away. He looked up at her with his dark eyes, and the gas giant turned behind him, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes in the moments when the world shifts its weight from one foot to the other, that the war was over. It just didn't know it yet. They brought him into the Velkash position, under her direct authority. His unit, once they understood what was happening, which took about 2 hours, during which time Akafar sat against a wall of natural rock with a Velkash medic doing things to his shoulder that hurt differently than he expected, not less but differently, as though the treatment was redirecting the pain rather than diminishing it, sending it somewhere it could be processed rather than just suppressed. His unit sent a request up the chain that eventually reached a general who said words that were not technically profanity because he invented them on the spot, and then said to hold. Hold was the right call. Akafar knew that. They were holding contact with a Velkash figure whose level of authority nobody on the human side had yet assessed, in a situation with no playbook, and the most important thing in the world right now was not to break it. He tried to think what his mother would do. She would sit very still and pay very close attention and not touch anything until she understood what she was looking at. She would annotate in the small handwriting. She would trust the process of observation over the impulse to act. He sat very still and paid very close attention. The Velkash medic finished with his shoulder. The damage was significant: cracked scapula, torn muscle, nerve disruption that would take months of therapy but manageable. He would keep the arm. The medic communicated this through gestures that were not quite human gestures but close enough that Akafar understood them, which told him something about convergent intelligence, that certain solutions arrived regardless of the biological substrate. You show the patient the damaged thing. You show them the repair. You give them the universal sign for ongoing, for not finished yet, for come back. Velshara returned an hour later. She brought a different guard configuration, fewer, different individuals positioned with their backs to the two of them rather than facing inward, which he noted as a deliberate choice, a statement made in the grammar of posture, and she brought something he hadn't seen before, a chamber. It wasn't large. It had been assembled from components that the guards carried, fitted together, with a speed and precision that suggested this was a thing that had been done many times, components that slotted and locked with barely audible clicks, each piece finding its place without instruction or visible communication between the guards assembling it. When it was complete, it was a low ovoid shape, roughly the size of a shipping container, sealed against the thin atmosphere of the moon. She touched his arm, not the wounded one, the other one, and guided him toward it, and he went because his read of her was that she was not done with the conversation that had started on the ridge, and because going seemed more likely to produce information than not going. Inside, the atmosphere was different, warmer. The air had a quality he couldn't name, a smell almost, but not quite a smell, something that registered in a part of his sensorium that didn't have a label, the way you sometimes become aware of a sound you've been hearing for a while without noticing. There was fluid on the floor, not standing water, something thicker, moving on its own in patterns too slow to be convection, too regular to be random, as though it was organized by something he couldn't see. He stood in it without sinking. It came to his ankles and held him with gentle pressure, like being held by something that had very large, very careful hands and was making absolutely certain not to grip. Velshara stood across from him in the chamber. The Velshin was still cracked at her shoulder. She hadn't repaired it. He understood, without quite knowing how he understood, that this was deliberate, that the crack on her shoulder was a statement she was making with her body. He didn't know what statement, not yet, but he filed it. She made a sound that was different from anything he'd heard from her yet, complex, layered, with harmonics in it that made his sternum vibrate, that made the fluid on the floor move in response, rising and falling in patterns that were clearly organized by the sound, shaped by it, the way sand shapes itself to music on a vibrating surface. The fluid moved toward his injured shoulder, rose against his side, and he felt the pain change, not diminish, not vanish, but restructure, become something he could set aside, a signal he could acknowledge and then not act on. Like turning down the volume on something without turning it off, like his mother annotating a problem rather than solving it immediately. You name it, you set it in the record, you come back to it when you understand what it means. He breathed. There was something in the chamber that he didn't have a frame for. Not the fluid, not the warmth, not the way the sound moved through the floor and up through his bones. Something in the quality of her attention. He had been in rooms with senior officers, with generals, with people who held his life in their hands through the authority of rank, and he had understood what their attention felt like, weighted, evaluating, constantly calculating the cost and benefit of what they were observing. He had been in rooms with civilians who looked at soldiers the way they looked at weather, something happening at a distance, something to be processed and categorized and moved past. He had been in rooms with other soldiers, where the attention had its own specific texture, close and careful, and alert in a way that came from shared experience of what it cost not to pay attention. Velshara's attention was none of those things. It was something he would later struggle to describe in his own language and eventually stop trying, because every word he reached for was the wrong shape. The closest he could get was that she was attending not to him as a problem, not to him as a data point, but to him as a fact. The way you attend to something that exists independently of your interest in it, and whose existence you are only just beginning to understand the shape of. She was watching his face. He had the sense she was learning the vocabulary of it, reading human expression the way he'd been trying to read Velkash expression, which was difficult because the face did different things. The eyes were structured differently. The body used different muscles to communicate differently. But she was looking. She was looking so hard and so carefully that he felt almost transparent, like something held up to light. He said, very quietly, even though he knew she wouldn't understand the words, "I don't know what the corridor is." She tilted her head. Among the Velkash, he would learn this was a significant gesture, the sign of active receptivity, of opening the processing centers to new input. It happened involuntarily, the way pupils dilate in the dark. She hadn't chosen to do it. He'd made her do it somehow, with 6 words she couldn't understand. He said, "I think that might be the problem. I think neither side knows what the other doesn't know, and if we could just—" He stopped. "Never mind, you don't speak English, I don't speak whatever you speak. But I think you know that we don't know. I think that's why you came up that ridge." She looked at him for a very long time. Then she made a sound he'd heard once before, on the ridge, right after the shot, the long, low vibrational one that moved through solid matter. But this time she held it longer, and there were variations within it, and he had the absolute irrational conviction that she was trying to talk to him, the way the people in the old stories try to talk to dolphins, not expecting immediate comprehension, not pretending the communication was complete, but making the attempt because the attempt was the thing, because the reaching was its own answer even when the language wasn't there yet. He thought about the researchers who had spent years in the water with dolphins, building a vocabulary from scratch, starting not with meaning but with the willingness to exchange sounds and see what happened, trusting that something would accumulate if you stayed with it long enough. He stayed very still and listened with his whole body. The fluid rose around him and held him and his shoulder quieted in the way it had quieted, and he listened. The ceasefire was announced 31 days later. In the history books, the ones written in the 20 years that followed, when the full shape of what had happened on Kesarim Ridge finally came clear, it would be described in terms of diplomatic breakthroughs and treaty frameworks, and the communication protocols that the Joint Velkash Human Contact Team developed over months of painstaking work. The historians would write about Velshara's political position within the Velkash Council, about how the cracked Velshan, which she had refused to repair, which she wore for the duration of the negotiations, which became an image so reproduced in both cultures' media that it ended up in museum collections on 3 planets, had functioned as a kind of political argument made visible, an authority figure who had been marked, who hadn't retreated, who was willing to stand in the broken place and let it be seen. They would write about the formal recognition of the corridor and the 800 years of its meaning, and about the 12 protocols humanity agreed to in order to achieve standing as a corridor-recognized species, and about the Joint Commission that spent 7 years determining which portions of the outer belt fell within the corridor's boundaries and which didn't. They would not write much about the night in the chamber on Kesarim with the fluid that moved to music, because Akafer didn't discuss it in interviews, and the Velkash didn't release their records of it, in a form the translation team could render with confidence for another decade, by which time the historians had moved on to the larger architecture of events, and the smaller personal texture of the night had been absorbed into the general category of things that happened in the process of the war ending. That was fine with him. Some things didn't need to be in the record. Some things lived in the space between official accounts and personal memory, in the gap between what could be documented and what could be known, and that gap was not a failure of the record keeping. It was the record itself, the private archive, the thing you kept not because it proved something but because it was true, and truth had its own uses even when they weren't legible to anyone but you. He thought about it sometimes in the years that followed, in the early mornings before the day accumulated its demands, or in the cold weather that still moved through his shoulder in a specific way, a particular ache that no therapy had fully resolved, and that he had come to think of as his own version of the cracked Velshan, not a failure, not damage in the diminishing sense, but a record. The mark that said, "This happened and it changed me." What Akafer could say, when he was asked, and he was asked many times, in interviews and hearings and the occasional conversation with someone who had read the right chapter in the right book and wanted to know what it had actually been like, was this: she didn't heal him, that's the wrong word for it. What she did was stay with him in the broken place. Both of them cracked at the shoulder, both of them bleeding in their respective ways, neither of them with words the other could understand, and she could have left at any point. She was a queen. She had a war to manage, a political position to protect, 600 years of Velkash ceremonial law governing what she was and was not permitted to do in the presence of adversaries. She had every reason to leave, and she was the kind of person who usually had very good reasons for everything she did. She stayed. And in staying, she communicated the thing that 11 months of warfare had obscured, the same thing that had gotten lost in the 3-word message and the destroyed stations and the bodies on both sides and the desperate push into Velkash space that the generals called Engagement 7, that there was something on both sides that wanted contact, wanted it badly enough to step into a bullet, wanted it badly enough to stand over the fallen stranger and not retreat. The negotiations were long and fractious, and nearly collapsed 14 times. HFY tracked the near collapses from outside the formal sessions. He had been retained as a consultant, a word he found mildly absurd, given that his consultation consisted almost entirely of being the person who'd done the thing, who carried in his body the specific memory of the ridge and the chamber, and who could be called upon when someone needed to know whether a proposed gesture or phrase or approach would land the way they intended it to. The first near collapse came in week 2, when the human diplomatic team, operating on incomplete translations and incomplete intelligence, used a phrase in the formal opening session that rendered in Velkash as something close to "we acknowledge the corridor" as a temporary inconvenience when they had meant "we acknowledge the corridor" as a matter of the highest importance. The error was in the modifying phrase. The Velkash word for highest importance and the Velkash word for temporary inconvenience shared a root that the translation algorithm hadn't yet distinguished. Velshara had been the one to catch it. She had, by that point, acquired the fastest learning grasp of basic English of any Velkash on the contact team, which her counsel found unsettling, and which she found straightforward, because she had been paying attention since the ridge, and she had called the session to a halt before anyone walked out. The second near collapse in week 4 was political rather than linguistic. A faction within the Velkash High Command that had never agreed with her position introduced evidence that the human push through Engagement 7 had included advanced mapping of Velkash homeworld approach vectors, which was technically true, and was also the standard military behavior of forces that had been at war for 11 months and had no way of knowing what the war was about. The human side's response to this accusation was righteous outrage at the implication, because from the human perspective, they had been fighting for their survival, and mapping the enemy's territory was elementary military practice. The outrage was understandable and counterproductive in roughly equal measure, and it nearly ended everything. The third near collapse in week 7 was the strangest and in some ways the most clarifying. It came from within the Velkash delegation itself, a challenge from a council member named, rendered approximately, Veldorath of the Second House, who argued that any negotiated settlement required the formal acknowledgement that humanity had violated the corridor, and that this acknowledgement must precede any other business. The human side refused. Their refusal was predicated on the legal logic that you couldn't acknowledge violating a rule you hadn't been told existed. The Velkash side countered with the argument that ignorance of the corridor was not a category that their law recognized, which was technically true, and also one of the most perfect examples of circular reasoning that the human diplomatic team had ever encountered in action. The circularity was not bad faith. The Velkash weren't being evasive. They genuinely could not conceive of the ignorance as an excuse, because they could not conceive of the ignorance as a real thing, even after 8 months of Velshara's argument to the contrary. Velshara herself broke the impasse by proposing a framework that neither side had suggested, not acknowledgement of violation, but acknowledgement of absence. Humanity would acknowledge that the corridor was unknown to them at the time of entry, and the Velkash would acknowledge that the standard process of corridor communication had not been completed before humanity's arrival. Both acknowledgments together constituted a shared error, not one party's fault, not one party's crime, but a gap in a process that both parties were now responsible for closing. The framework took 3 days to articulate in language that both sides' legal teams could accept, and when it was accepted, it shifted something in the room that HFY, watching from the consultation tier, felt rather than observed. The air changed quality, the same way it had changed on the ridge. He was not a diplomat. He had no standing in the formal sessions. He had been retained as a consultant, a word he found amusing, given that his consultation consisted almost entirely of being the person who'd done the thing, who carried in his body the specific memory of the ridge and the chamber, and who could be called upon when someone needed to know whether a proposed gesture or phrase or approach would land the way they intended it to. He consulted twice at critical moments. The first was in week 9, when the corridor boundary negotiations deadlocked completely. Both sides had produced maps that agreed nowhere and conflicted everywhere. The Velkash maps represented the corridor as something that had grown organically over 8 centuries, its edges defined by historical passage rather than astronomical coordinates. The human maps were based on physical measurements and coordinate systems, and couldn't process an edge that moved. That was defined by accumulated memory of transit rather than fixed position in space. Akafor looked at the maps side by side and thought about dolphins, about the way they navigated by pressure and sound and the feel of the water, by a network of sensation that had no coordinate system a human instrument could measure, but that was absolutely precise, that got them where they were going every time. The ocean wasn't mapped by dolphins. It was known. The difference mattered. He described this to the lead human negotiator, who looked at him as though he had said something irrelevant, and then gradually, over the next 20 minutes, began to look at him differently. The Velkash concept of the corridor was not geographical in the human sense. It was navigational. It was defined by passage, by the accumulated memory of where things had moved and for what purpose, and with what relationship to the space they moved through. If humanity agreed to have their passage through the corridor logged, acknowledged, recorded, made part of the navigational memory, inserted into the 800-year record the same way you'd add a new tributary to a river system, the boundaries became negotiable because they became dynamic. Not a fixed line but a living record. Not a border but a history. It took another 3 weeks to work out the details, but that was the unlock. The boundary commission that emerged from it was something that had no precedent in human international law and only loose precedent in Velkash corridor law. And it worked because it was built on the actual nature of the thing. It was trying to describe rather than the legal infrastructure that had existed before the thing needed describing. The second time Akafor was called in was in week 14, when a Velkash council member, the same Veldorath who had argued for the formal violation acknowledgement, directly challenged Velshara's authority to negotiate on behalf of the Third House of Kesarim, arguing that a Velshan that remained unrepaired was a Velshan that had been abandoned, that she had forfeited her standing by choosing to display the damage rather than restore the carapace. This was, Akafor was told, a serious charge. It mapped roughly to something between a claim of incompetence and a claim of deliberate self-abasement, neither of which were acceptable in a figure of her rank. The Velshan was not just armor. It was the external expression of the house's continuity. To let it remain broken was to let the house be seen as broken. He asked to see her. They met in a room that was neither Velkash nor human, a neutral space the joint team had constructed that felt like the inside of a question, bare walls, 2 chairs that were human, 1 surface platform that was Velkash, a light source that split the difference between the wavelengths each species preferred and satisfied neither perfectly. He'd come to think of it as the honest room, because nothing in it pretended to be comfortable, and that honesty was oddly restful. She came in and he saw that the Velshan at her shoulder was still cracked, had been cracked for 3.5 months. There was a kind of negative light around the break, a place where the phosphorescent engraving had gone dark, the pattern interrupted, a sentence left unfinished in the language of light and ceremony. He said, "They're saying you abandoned it." She said in her careful new English, which had a rhythm to it unlike any human accent, as though the words were being placed deliberately, weighted, the way you carry something fragile over uneven ground. "Yes." "Did you?" She was quiet for a moment. I made a choice. The crack is the record of the choice. I do not repair the record. He thought about that. He thought about his own shoulder, which had been repaired by a very good surgical team and a physiotherapist who'd spent 8 months working on his mobility, and which still ached in cold weather, and which he never mentioned because there was nothing useful in mentioning it. But it was there. The record was there. In the way his arm moved and the way he reached for things and the small adjustments his body had learned to make for what it now was rather than what it had been. In my culture, he said, there are people who mark their bodies on purpose, to remember things, a scar they keep, a tattoo. Something that says, this happened and it changed me. She listened with the stillness she brought to everything, the Velkash quality of attention that operated like a held breath, as if the whole body was waiting for what the ears were bringing in. The crack is the mark. It says this happened and it changed you. And it changed the war, she said. Yes. She looked at him with the look he'd first felt on the ridge. The one that went several layers deep, that was trying to reach something underneath the surface presentation of a person and understand the structure of them, the actual material they were made of. In Velkash tradition, she said slowly, a Velshan that has been cracked and not repaired is a Velshan that has been abandoned. This is the reading of the law. But the law was written in a time when our Velshan were cracked only in defeat, only when the house fell. She paused. This is not that. No, he said, it isn't. I am arguing, she said, that the law did not account for this. What is this? She looked at him for a long moment, a crack that opens something rather than breaks it. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would improve on that. She went back into the session. She spoke for 40 minutes in Velkash, and the translation team told him later that it was the most complex piece of legal ceremonial argument they had yet attempted to render, and that they were confident they had gotten perhaps 70% of it, and that the 70% they had was extraordinary. She had argued that the Velshan crack represented a category that Velkash law had not previously needed, damage received in the act of contact, damage that was not defeat, not failure, but the mark of the moment when two things met across an unbridgeable difference and found that the bridge was possible after all, that to repair it would be to remove the evidence of what was possible, that a house which erased its evidence was a house that couldn't build on it. That the corridor itself, the 800-year corridor, the living record of all passage and all recognition, was built entirely of marks like this one. Every species that had ever been recognized in the corridor had a record of the moment of recognition. This was the third house of Kesarim's record. She was wearing it. The council debated for 6 hours. At the end of 6 hours they voted. Velshara kept her standing. The treaty was signed 11 months and 3 days after Akafar had stepped in front of a bullet on the ridge of a frozen moon. The signing ceremony was elaborate by any standard. There were 87 distinct elements in the Velkash ceremonial framework alone, each of which had required individual negotiation with the human diplomatic team to determine what had an equivalent and what needed an accommodation, and what could simply be witnessed without participation. The ceremony took 4 hours. Akafar was present as part of the human delegation's secondary tier, not a primary signatory, not a formal diplomat, just one of the people in the room because someone had decided he should be in the room, which was as good a reason as any for being anywhere. He watched the primary signatories exchange the objects that the ceremony required and speak the words that the translators had spent 8 weeks perfecting and stand in the positions that the Velkash ceremonial law mandated. And it was all very impressive and very formal, and he felt, watching it, a kind of distance that he hadn't expected. The ceremony was the shape of the thing, not the thing. The thing had already happened, months ago, on a ridge at 400 hours in gas giant light, in the cold. After the signing, in the long period of reception that followed, both species delegations circulating in the neutral space that had expanded now to accommodate several hundred beings on each side. Velshara found him. She moved through the crowd the way she'd moved up the ridge. The same quality of passage, the weight of someone accustomed to the world rearranging itself around her, except that he'd come to understand it was more specific than that. She didn't expect the world to move for her. She simply moved with a certainty that made room for itself. She stopped in front of him. They looked at each other. "Sergeant Akaffer," she said. She had his name exactly right. Had had it exactly right since approximately week 3, which was faster than most human members of the contact team had gotten her name to a passable approximation. Velshara of the 3rd House of Kesarim. The crack in her Velshan was still there, dark against the phosphorescent engraving, the record. She said, "How is your shoulder?" "Cold weather bothers it," he said, "otherwise fine." She made the sound he'd come to think of as the Velkash equivalent of a wry smile, a low harmonic, brief, with a specific quality he'd have struggled to describe to anyone who hadn't heard it but which he now recognized instantly, the way you recognize someone's laugh before you see their face. "You should avoid cold weather." "I tried that," he said. "I ended up on a frozen moon." She tilted her head, the involuntary gesture, active receptivity. She still couldn't entirely control it, even now, even in a diplomatic reception after 4 months of intensive human contact. Some things the body just did when surprised. He'd come to find it one of the most honest things about her. "It was not a coincidence," she said, "that I walked up that ridge. No, I figured. I had studied human behavior for 8 months. I had a theory." She paused. "I was not certain the theory would survive contact with an actual human." "How's the theory holding up?" She was quiet for a moment. The crowd moved around them, multilingual, multi-strange. Hundreds of beings in the same room doing the social arithmetic of a situation that had no precedent, arriving at answers that would take generations to fully compute. "Better than the Velshan," she said. He laughed. He hadn't expected to laugh. It came out of him as the genuine article, unmanaged, and she watched it with the look she'd worn in the chamber, the learning look, the vocabulary-building look, and then she made the harmonic again. Around them, the signing reception continued. Diplomats and generals and council members circulated with their drinks and their calculations. The treaty existed now. The corridor recognition existed. The protocols and the boundary frameworks and the 12 agreements and the Joint Commission, and all the work that would have to be done over the decades to follow, all of it existed. The war was over, and the long, slow process of figuring out what the peace meant was underway, and it would take longer than any single life on either side, and be harder than the war in the ways that peace is always harder than war. Peace required continuous maintenance in a way that war didn't. War just required continuation. Peace required the daily choice to keep choosing it, to keep doing the harder thing, to keep finding the language even when the language didn't have words for what needed saying. None of that changed on a ridge. None of it ended with a bullet stopped. He thought about his mother at the kitchen table. He thought about the schematics spread across it, the small handwriting, the way she'd annotate rather than solve in the first pass. He thought about the things she'd told him once that he had not understood at the time, and had spent the better part of his adult life gradually understanding. That the first thing you had to do with a failing system was resist the impulse to fix it before you understood it. That the impulse to fix was faster and louder than the impulse to understand, and that if you let it run the show, you'd spend your whole career patching symptoms and wondering why nothing got better. He thought the war had been 11 months of patching symptoms. Both sides. The Velkash firing because humans wouldn't stop moving. Humans firing because the Velkash wouldn't explain. Each side responding to the behavior the other side was showing without any access to the structure underneath the behavior, without any way to know what was driving it, without any language for asking. both sides building strategies around the legible surface of a situation whose actual nature was buried somewhere neither side was looking. What stopped with a bullet was something else, something smaller and more fundamental, the kind of thing that has to stop before anything larger can start. The assumption that the two things facing each other across the dark were only weapons, that the only grammar between them was the grammar of force. That force was the language, and there was no other language available, and the only question was who would run out of things to say first. He'd stepped into the line of fire because something in him said not yet. He still didn't know what he'd been waiting for. He hadn't known in the moment. In the moment he hadn't been reasoning, he'd been responding, the way you respond to a gear grinding, the way the body knows before the mind that something is about to be wasted that shouldn't be wasted. Looking back, he thought, he'd been waiting for the sentence to finish. 11 months of a conversation conducted entirely in violence, and the sentence had never been allowed to finish. Someone always fired before the period. And whatever the sentence was going to be, whatever meaning was on the other side of the communication that both sides had been attempting and failing at for almost a year, it needed one more second. Just one more second of not shooting. So he'd stepped. Velshara had finished the sentence. He supposed that was how it worked. You stepped, and the other person finished. Or the other person stepped, and you finished. The point was that it took two, that no one could do the whole thing alone, that the corridor between one thing and another could only be opened from both ends simultaneously, that the recognition had to run both directions for either direction to be real. She had come up a ridge in the dark to test a theory. He had stepped out from behind a rock because something ground wrong. Neither of them had planned it. Neither of them had known. They had been operating on the specific human and Velkash equivalent of instinct, which was not wisdom and not courage, and not any of the words the history books would reach for, but which was perhaps the thing underneath all of those words, the refusal to let the sentence end before it was finished. She looked at him, he looked back. The crowd moved around them. "Same time next century," he said. She made the harmonic. He'd come to think of it as her laugh, which was probably wrong, probably too neat a translation, but which was the translation he was keeping. "You will not live that long," she said. "No," he agreed. "But somebody will." She tilted her head, the involuntary one, the receiving gesture, the one that meant the body was open to something that surprised it. "Yes," she said, "somebody will." The gas giant wasn't in this sky, they were on a station now, not a moon in a different system, but he felt it anyway. The enormous slow turning of something too large to hurry, that had been turning before either of their species existed and would go on turning when both of them were memory. The corridor was there too, probably. All the corridors, all the paths between all the things. The galaxy was enormous and mostly empty, and also, it turned out, full of history and claim and meaning, full of passages laid down by beings moving through the dark toward each other, full of the accumulated evidence of every time something had stopped before the sentence ended, and every time something had managed, barely, to let it finish. He thought not yet was never about not, it was always about yet. The reception went on around them. They stood in it, slightly apart from the flow of it, in the complicated silence of two beings who had met at the worst angle and somehow arrived at this. The silence that was not empty, the kind that still held the shape of everything it had carried to get here. He thought of dolphins. He thought of the way they navigated by what they couldn't see, by the echo of the sound they'd sent into the dark, the return of it, the information in the return. He'd sent something into the dark on a frozen ridge at 400 hours in gas giant light. He hadn't known what he was sending. He just stepped. It had come back changed. He supposed that was the whole story, not the treaty, not the 12 protocols, not the Joint Commission or the boundary framework or the corridor recognition that would reshape the political map of this arm of the galaxy for the next 100 years. All of that was real and all of that mattered, and none of it was the story. The story was the step and the staying. The two of them cracked at the shoulder, bleeding in their respective ways, neither one leaving the broken place. That was the whole story. Everything else was what grew from it.